Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and in this module we're going to encounter the Necropolis of Abydos, the Step-Pyramid of Djoser, the tombs of pharaohs, the birth of architecture, and everyone's favorite, Egyptian mathematics. Because we're going to look at the actual archaeology of the pyramids, and we're going to look at the archaeology in Egypt. We're going to use it to test our hypotheses to date. We're going to follow the outline right up above that should serve as a table of contents for your notes. And let's go ahead and just jump right in. And all of this is in service to that question right there. And the question is, who built the pyramids of Egypt? Evaluate the three hypotheses given about the construction of the Great Pyramids of Giza, which is the simplest and therefore the most likely, which is the least likely, which is supported by the current archaeological evidence, because we're going to look at why you should explore the past, why we should do archaeology, and we're going to use those thought tools that were discussed earlier to judge our three hypotheses against the archaeological evidence from Egypt herself. Now, the first thing you need to understand about ancient Egypt is very, 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 very old. Egypt is very, very old. All right. And I've made this little chart you can see there on the left. The blue is the entire history of the United States of America. You and I are at the top of that little blue column. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are at the bottom of that little blue column. The yellow column is Pharaonic Egypt. This is how impossibly old Egypt actually is. And I've used that this very famous picture of Cleopatra right up above me, who probably did not look like Elizabeth Taylor, but anyway. One of the things about Cleopatra, the last ruler of a free Egypt, is Cleopatra lives closer to our time than she did to the construction of the Great Pyramids. This is just how mind-bogglingly old Egypt actually is. By any standard, Egypt was one of the most successful civilizations to have ever existed on our planet. It just is also one that died out, 2,000 years ago. And Egypt didn't come from nowhere. Egypt itself, Pharaonic Egypt itself, has a long pre-Pharaonic civilization that comes before it. Egypt began as a series of scattered villages along the Nile River from about 7,000 BC to 3,100 BC. So in other words, you take that yellow column, and if you include pre-Pharaonic Egypt, you double the size of that yellow column. That's how old Egypt is. If there was never a pharaoh in Egypt, if they never built the pyramids, the pre-Pharaonic civilization would still be regarded as one of the great civilizations of the world. But for 4,000 years, this pre-Pharaonic civilization grew, and eventually it coalesced into a series of small warring kingdoms along the Nile. And most of what we understand about Egyptian mythology, Egyptian religion, Egyptian cosmology, all of this originates and it comes out of pre-Pharaonic Egypt. This long, slow period of development where Egypt gradually progressed from villages to towns to small kingdoms, and eventually into a series of about half a dozen kingdoms that eventually coalesced into two larger kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt, and then they were eventually unified by the first king of unified Egypt, a person we call the Pharaoh Narmer, even though they weren't actually called pharaohs until like much, much later. And those are some artifacts on the left from pre-Pharaonic Egypt. It was truly a remarkable civilization for hundreds of years before they even thought about building a pyramid. And a way to kind of grasp exactly, how old Egypt is to understand that there really isn't a single Egyptian civilization, but rather what you have is 5 civilizations, each civilization built on the ruins of what came before. And There is the sequence as developed, I think it was originally developed by Manetho back in the 3rd century BC. And this is basically how these many Egyptian civilizations preceded each other. The first Egyptian civilization is pre-Pharaonic Egypt. That's the one we've already discussed, that eventually coalesced from small villages to small kingdoms to 2 kingdoms to the unification of Egypt under Narmer. That is the first Egyptian civilization. Pre-Pharaonic Egypt gives way to the Old Kingdom. And there's the Old Kingdom right up there, roughly 2686 to 2181 BC. This is the Old Kingdom. This is the first Pharaonic civilization in Egypt. This is also the age of the pyramids, at least according to Manetho. And it is in this period where they built the great necropolises of Abydos, the great necropolis of Saqqara, the great necropolis of Giza. All right, it is the age of the pyramids, the Old Kingdom. And the Old Kingdom collapses in a series of extremely nasty religious wars, which is the first intermediate period. And eventually, things are reorganized into the third great Egyptian civilization. That's known as the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom, roughly 2055 to 1650 BC, the Middle Kingdom can be seen as an attempt to rebuild and to recapture the glory days of the Old Kingdom. They still continue to build pyramids, except as we'll see, the pyramids aren't nearly as nice and they haven't lasted in as nearly a good a condition. And they attempted to settle some of the religious squabbling and religious civil wars that destroyed the Old Kingdom. But the Middle Kingdom was never stable. It was never secure. And the Middle Kingdom itself was completely unprepared for what came next, which was the invasion of a group of foreign people known as the Hyksos. So the Hyksos come in, destroy the Middle Kingdom. And then for the next 200 years, there's this struggle in Egypt itself between the native Egyptians and the invading Hyksos. This is the second intermediate period. Eventually, the Egyptians are able to win out. And one of the reasons the Hyksos were so successful is that the Hyksos had iron tools and iron weapon. And prior to the second intermediate period, Egypt was completely a Bronze Age civilization. The Hyksos are eventually expelled, and this gives rise to New Kingdom Egypt, the fourth Egyptian civilization. There it is, right over there, roughly 1550 to 1069 BC. We're 1,000 years away from Rome, right? 1,000 years away from the time of the Bible. This is the New Kingdom. New to Egypt. To us, it's 3,000 years in the past. New Kingdom Egypt is Iron Age Egypt. This is Egypt with iron. This is also, in order to protect themselves from another huge invasion like the Hyksos, the Egyptians proceed to invade the areas around them. And this is the period of what's known as the Great Egyptian Empire, where Egypt went to the west and conquered what is now today coastal Libya. They launched invasions above the cataracts, deep into Central Africa, and they invaded the Middle East, conquering large portions of the Fertile Crescent and the modern Middle East today. New Kingdom Egypt was not interested in pyramids at all, but rather the New Kingdom pharaohs wanted to be buried into these underground, necropolises. And this is where you get things like Valley of the Kings, Valley of the Queens. The most famous pharaoh from the New Kingdom is probably Tutankhamun himself, King Tut, the boy king who died young and whose tomb was undiscovered up until the 1920s. But probably one of the most famous of the New Kingdom pharaohs was a guy called Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. And Ramses the Great leads this huge Egyptian army into the Middle East, rampaging up and down the coast of the Levant, getting into a war with the Hittites. And the thing is, most biblical scholars generally argue that it is Ramses II who is generally regarded as the pharaoh from the Hebrew Bible. It is Ramses II who is generally accepted to be the Egyptian pharaoh that's mentioned in the book of Exodus. One of the things about the book of Exodus is that it's only Pharaoh. Pharaoh's never given a proper name. And there's either one of two candidates that is the Pharaoh from Exodus. It's either Ramses II or his grandson Mernptah. And one of the things about Mernptah is Mernptah raises this big monument in the desert called the Mernptah Stela. And on the Mernptah Stela, it lists a series of his military victories. And on the Mernptah Stela, it lists one of his victories is over the kingdom of Israel. And it's the first historical record of the Jewish people in the Middle East, their defeat by New Kingdom Egypt. So it is generally assumed that it is the New Kingdom where the events of the book of Exodus take place, where the Hebrews were enslaved by the Egyptians and spent many generations bonded in the land of Egypt. Now, this should send up a red flag for you right off the bat. The pyramids were built way back there, way back in the Old Kingdom. The Hebrews, the Jews, were slaves in Egypt right there in the New Kingdom. This should immediately cause a problem for one of our hypotheses. And you should probably pause the video and write down what that problem is and maybe subtract two numbers to get a period of time. At any rate, the New Kingdom itself becomes overextended. The great Egyptian empire eventually implodes and collapses. Egypt itself is overwhelmed and conquered by the Persian Empire. And then the Persian Empire itself is destroyed by Greeks and Alexander the Great himself. Alexander the Great dies, and Alexander's empire is torn apart by his generals. And one of these generals is a guy called Ptolemy. And Ptolemy will go on to build the fifth and final Egyptian civilization. This is Ptolemaic Egypt, and it's right there at the bottom. And Ptolemaic Egypt is really, really easy to remember. In fact, here's a bit of information to impress your friends. I'm about to teach you the names of all of the pharaohs of Ptolemaic Egypt. The first pharaoh is called Ptolemy I. The second pharaoh is Ptolemy II. The third pharaoh is Ptolemy III. The fourth pharaoh is Ptolemy IV. The fifth Ptolemaic pharaoh was Ptolemy V, and you get the point. It goes all the way to Ptolemy XIII. And then there's Cleopatra, who is the last ruler of an independent Egypt. But here's the thing about the Ptolemies. Here's the thing about Ptolemaic Egypt. The Ptolemies were not actually Egyptian. Ptolemy himself, Ptolemy I, was Greek, and the family maintained very good relationships with the Greeks throughout their entire reign, through the 300 years they ruled Egypt. But here's the thing about the Ptolemaics, the Ptolemaic pharaohs of Egypt. They were a Greek family ruling over Egypt, but instead of trying to impose Greek culture and Greek religion on Egypt, what happened with the Ptolemies is that the Ptolemies basically completely abandoned most of their Greek culture and Greek religion and essentially completely and thoroughly embraced Egyptian civilization. In fact, the Ptolemies tried to kind of out-Egypt the Egyptians. The Ptolemies are like that one friend that everybody has that moves to Texas and buys a belt buckle the size of a dinner plate and drives a big Ford F-150 and wears cowboy boots and a big Stetson and speaks with a drawl. And they're like, I love Texas. And I'm like, John, you're from Connecticut. That's the Ptolemies. They're from Greece, but basically they basically try to out-Egypt the Egyptians. They become more Egypt than the Egyptians. They adopt sibling marriage. They're into mummification. They're into tombs. This is the era of the golden mummies. That's all Ptolemaic Egypt. And one of the things that the Ptolemies do in Egypt is they go through the Nile Valley and they start reconstructing a lot of these old ruined palaces. A lot of these old ruined temples are given facelifts. They're cleaned up, or in some places, completely reconstructed brand new. And the Greeks were really, really impressed with Egypt. And Ptolemy attempted to out-Egypt the Egyptians. And some of the old Egyptian temples were simply too badly damaged or too crumbling to save. And in that cases, The Ptolemies brought in Greek architects and Greek engineers and simply rebuilt the whole thing. And that up there on the upper left, this is one of the temples that the Ptolemies rebuilt. And this gets very important. I want you to open your head for a second and get ready for this. Okay? Is your head open? Are you ready? Because here comes a big nugget of information. That temple up there on the left it's really interesting architecturally because it is an Egyptian style temple, but it has been reconstructed using the principles of Greek architecture. So if you look at it and it looks kind of like the Parthenon or all these columned temples from Greece, it's because it's the same architects, just giving it kind of this Egyptian flair. That building is the Temple of Hathor, okay? It is located at the site of Dendera. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera, with all of its wall carvings carved at the same time, was built during Ptolemaic Egypt. It was rebuilt in the year 150 BC. It was built during recorded history. And this should send up a big red flag for one of the ideas of one of our hypotheses, that the Temple of Hathor in Dendera, along with its wall carvings, does not date to the age of the pyramids. Now, Egypt itself can basically be described as a civilization that evolved in a narrow hallway, which is the Nile Valley. And running through the middle of that narrow hallway is the Nile River itself. Now, people look at the map, and this is something about Egyptian archaeology that tends to throw most people for a loop, because you've got two parts of Egypt. You have Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Those are named because of their elevations. Upper Egypt is high and Lower Egypt is low, but that's not based on any map. See, we're used to maps. We look at a map and we want Upper Egypt to be at the top of the map and Lower Egypt to be at the bottom of the map. But that's not true. Upper Egypt is there. It's at the bottom. Lower Egypt is at the top, right there. That's Lower Egypt, okay? So the Egyptians lived in this narrow riverine corridor of the Nile Valley itself. And many of these, they were very restricted in their agricultural area. They only had so much land to grow crops in. So when they're building funerary complexes, when they go to build a necropolis, they're not going to put these religious structures, they're not going to put this funerary architecture inside the Nile Valley itself. It makes no sense to bury people in agriculturally fertile land when you have only a small and finite amount of it. On the other hand, what you can do is go outside of the Nile Valley into the high desert that's on either side of the river, and you can build things there, and you can bury people there. And there they're going to last forever, for a very, very long time. So this is why many of the temple complexes, many of the necropolis are not placed in the Nile Valley, but they're actually placed on the high desert on either side of the Nile Valley. And the Giza complex is only one of many necropolises to be found in that high desert on either side of the Nile Valley. Now, one of the oldest and most extensive of these necropolis is called Abydos. It's the Necropolis of Abydos. And on the upper left, you see there's a map of the necropolis itself. Nobody really visits Abydos because there's like no pyramids there. But what there's a series of tombs and mastabas. Stick a pin in that because we're about to talk about mastabas in a very short period. So you can see the map of Abydos, and you notice that it's in the heights, it's in the rocky highlands, just outside of the fertile Nile plain. But at Abydos, you have these rock-cut tombs, these shaft tombs that are driven into the bedrock underneath the desert stands themselves. And you have all of these different mastabas that are lined up with people that are buried inside of it. And you can see the map on the lower left, this row of mastabas. And right there, there's a row of mastabas themselves, these sort of rock-cut tombs. And in front of these tombs, on these mastabas, would be carved the name and the title of the family or the individual who is buried in these the tombs underneath the mastabas. So, what actually is a mastaba? All right. That right there is a mastaba, okay? A mastaba is a rock-cut tomb. You can see the diagram there on the lower left. So you clear the desert sands, you drive a shaft down into bedrock. At the bottom of this shaft, you carve out a tomb chamber. That's where the person is going to stay. And then on top of that, you build either with limestone slabs or with mud bricks, you build this large rectangular structure directly on top of the shaft. That is a mastaba. It is a piece of Egyptian funerary architecture to be placed in the high desert above a rock-cut tomb at the bottom of a long shaft. Mastabas are part of all 5 Egyptian civilizations. They predate the pyramid, they're used during the age of the pyramids, and they're used for centuries, for millennia, after the Egyptians have quit building pyramids. Mastabas predate any of the great pyramids, and they can continue to be used by the Egyptians throughout the Pharaonic period. Indeed, most of these necropolises that we're going to look at, most of the structures that are there are just mastabas. So a mastaba, you either can have an individual buried there, or sometimes they'll like function like family crypts, and you'll have 2 or 3 tombs underneath a single mastaba. And sometimes you can have multiple people buried inside one of these tomb chambers. But one of the thing about these mastabas is that not every mastaba was equal. That if you were very wealthy and if you had a high status in Egyptian civilization, your mastaba would be really nice. Okay, if you were a grand vizier, all right, or a successful general, you'd have like a really nice mastaba. If you were only if you were a common worker or a potter or a weaver, you might not get a very big mastaba, and your mastaba is going to be mud instead of limestone. But it doesn't matter. The important thing here is to understand that the size and degree of elaboration of your mastaba directly correlates to your status in Egyptian civilization. And right up above me is the tomb of Queen Mernith. And that is her mastaba right up above me. She's buried underneath there, and it's a huge mastaba. It's just absolutely gigantic. It contains 2 layers with a series of lesser mastabas all around it. Those are people that were attached or were clients of Queen Mernith. We know it's Queen Mernith's mastaba because there's stela on the front of the mastaba that with her name on it that give a list of her dates. Sometimes there's rooms inside the mastabas with a series of prayers and a series of incantations, funerary incantations that can be made over the grave or over the tomb of the individual. And all of that eventually becomes known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, but that's another story. So, the size and degree of elaboration of your mastaba is a direct correlation to your status in society. And this is where we meet one of the first people that we're going to meet, which is a pharaoh called Djoser. Djoser wants a really, really elaborate mastaba. So he goes to his grand vizier, a man named Imhotep. And he asks Imhotep to design him a mastaba that probably looks something like Queen Mernith's mastaba, except much larger and much more elaborate. And Imhotep, the Grand Vizier of Egypt, the guy who actually runs the country for the Pharaoh Djoser, contemplates this and comes up with a really radical idea. That how about, instead of just a really huge mastaba, or even a 2-layered mastaba like Queen Mernith has, what if we stacked mastabas one on top of the other? And let's do this where Djoser wants to be entombed, at the Necropolis of Saqqara. And this is the origin of, oh, there it is, that pyramid right up above me, the Step-Pyramid of Djoser. All right? Designed according to the histories of Manetho, designed by a doctor and an architect named Imhotep. And there is a statue of Imhotep there to the left. He gets deified later on. Imhotep is just this important historical figure in the Old Kingdom. By the time you get to the New Kingdom, he's like a minor god of medicine and engineering. So Imhotep designs this radical new mastaba for the pharaoh Djoser. And that's it. The Step-Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, the first great Egyptian pyramid, built between 2667, completed in 2648. There it is, and you can see, you can look at it. It's literally no more than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's really no more than 6 mastabas stacked one on top of the other. That kind of comes to this rough point. And again, it isn't alone in the desert. In this necropolis, it's surrounded by hundreds of graves, by dozens and dozens, hundreds of mastabas. And the Pyramid of Djoser itself actually sits inside this entire ritual compound that includes a funerary chamber. It includes this wide walled area. All of this stuff dedicated to the construction, dedicated to the housing and veneration of the pharaoh Djoser. And it is one of Djoser's successors who decides he wants something a little more impressive than a step pyramid. I don't remember if it's his son or grandson, but there is this Egyptian pharaoh called Snefru. Good King Snefru is the legends about the pharaoh Snefru. Snefru wants a huge pyramid like Imhotep built for Djoser. And this is to be built at a place called Needham. And they began construction of this pyramid at Needham. There is an architectural drawing of it there on the lower left. And again, it's going to be a series of mastabas. But what they're going to do is after they've stacked the mastabas, they're going to even off the sides. So each of the sides are nice and smooth. But something happened. They never finished the pyramid at Needham because roughly 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through construction, someone made an engineering error in the base. And the weight of the stones at the top of the pyramid broke the stones at the bottom of the pyramid, and the pyramid collapsed. The sides of the pyramid slid down to form that huge pile of rubble that can be found all around the failed pyramid at Needham. I mean, it shows you how the pyramid was constructed, but this was the great failed pyramid of Needham. Which means somewhere back in the 3rd millennium BC, a bunch of Egyptians were looking at a pyramid, watching it collapse, and then they had a conversation about who had to go tell the pharaoh that his pyramid had just fallen down, and there was no way to save it because the engineering had been completely off. So that happened in antiquity. But it was undaunted, all right? They said, okay, we know what went wrong at Needham. We're going to build you an even better pyramid at the necropolis at a place called Dashur. And this is how they solved that engineering problem that caused the pyramid to collapse at Needham. They decided to create a bent pyramid. That what they're going to do is build the pyramid and then about 2/3 of the way up, change the angle of the areas. So the result is this, kind of ugly but functional pyramid that is today known as the bent pyramid, built 2600 BC. And they changed the angle at the side of the pyramid in order to solve that engineering problem, so that there wasn't so much weight at the top that it would crack the stones below it. But Snefru is on his 3rd pyramid, and they eventually decide on the first true pyramid, and this is going to be the red pyramid at Dashur. Again, built around 2600 for the pharaoh Snefru. This is the first really true pyramid. It's called the red pyramid because, supposedly when the sun hits it at a certain time of day, it gets this orange-red look to it. Anyway, all of these pyramids were originally covered in bright white limestone. So when the sun hit them, they would have actually almost glowed. Like if you would have, even in the daytime, if you would have been crossing the desert, you would have seen a pyramid from, miles and miles away. It would be this huge glowing white thing on the horizon. And what they did with the red pyramid is that they basically took a really gentle angle for the entire thing. And the result is, you can see it right there. It's this very broad, not a terribly impressive pyramid, but one that's not bad, but one that shows them that they have worked out all of these engineering problems so that they don't have to create a bent pyramid, or that their pyramid's not going to like fall apart like it did at Needham. So you have this sequence of pyramids. We have the step pyramid, we have the failed pyramid, we have the bent pyramid, and here we have the red pyramid, because the next set of pyramids that are about to be constructed are the Great Pyramids themselves. Snefru's grandson is the pharaoh Khufu, and it is he who builds the first of the 3 Great Pyramids on the Giza necropolis. You can see it right up above. And there's Khufu builds his Great Pyramid, his son Menkaure builds the second pyramid there, and then finally there's Khafra, who builds his pyramid there as well. And Giza has the largest pyramids and the best preserved pyramids, but it's not the oldest or the largest of these Egyptian necropolises. And in fact, you look at a lot of like tourist guides and they talk about Egypt and stuff. A lot of them say if you really want this kind of exotic, if you want to like commune with this ancient Egyptian architecture, you shouldn't go to Giza. You should actually go to the necropolis at Saqqara, because it's really, really remote, and there's not going to be like taxi drivers honking at each other and bus drivers yelling at each other over your shoulder, like there is at Giza. And finally, there's the question of exactly how they built the pyramids themselves. And lots of different ideas have been floated about. Basically, again, the simplest solution is the most likely solution, Occam's razor. This is probably the most likely way they built the pyramids. They started with a large foundation and a large ramp, and the ramp was increased until the pyramid got about either a third a way up, and then they simply started to wrap these sort of mud improvised ramps, corkscrewing it around the pyramid until they reached the top. And when they were finished with that, then they could just remove all of that earthen scaffolding and just have a nice, huge white pyramid. But it is debated exactly how they did it. Alternate theories have argued some sort of like steepled ramps. We do know that they definitely started at the bottom. So, I mean, if you started building a pyramid at the top, it would be really, really difficult. But I want to stop for a moment and point out the architectural drawing right up above me. Because I want to point out about even the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Even though it's huge, even though it's impressive, if you actually look at a cutaway diagram of how it was actually constructed, it's still really just a series of stacked mastabas. One mastaba stacked on top of itself. At the end of the day, the Great Pyramids are really nothing more than huge, elaborate mastabas. Now, how did they actually build these things? Did they actually have the wherewithal to construct these things? Building a pyramid does require pretty interesting and pretty complex mathematics. You do need to know the Pythagorean Theorem in order to make sure your right angles are actually right, are actually correct. You do actually have to have some kind of working knowledge of cosine in order that the angles of your pyramid actually meet at a point and they're not like all wonky, or they don't change direction over time. And again, Hypothesis 2 argued that the Egyptians do not actually have the mathematical ability to do this. But the thing is, they did. All right. And we have things like papyruses, and there on the upper left is a papyrus showing Egyptian math. The Egyptians had very elaborate math. They had very accurate math. At the top of right above my little yellow box, you can actually see exactly how Egyptian numeracy worked. And here's the thing, they actually had the Pythagorean theorem. I mean, it wasn't expressed algebraically. It wasn't expressed like a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But they knew that right angles have certain sets of ratioed relationships, and you can duplicate these over time. And if you duplicate them in a certain way, you can create architecturally very stable structures. As a matter of fact, the Pythagorean theorem is often misnamed. It's named after the great it's named after the great Greek mathematician Pythagoras. But here's the rub. Pythagoras actually stole it from the Egyptians. If there was any justice in the world, we wouldn't call it the Pythagorean theorem. We would call it the Egyptian theorem, because they had it first. All right. And right up above me, I want you to kind of look at that for a second and try to think what that is, because these were rods that were often found in pharaonic tombs or in the tombs of grand viziers, and they were all identical. Because that right up above me, that is an Egyptian measuring stick. It's a measuring rod. The standard Egyptian unit of measure was something called a cubit, and cubits were divided into hands, and hands were subdivided into fingers. So they had set and established systems of measures and weights. And we know this because we could actually take the dimensions of most Egyptian architecture, and you find that it's evenly divisible by a single cubit. People actually have done this. Actually, people did it like in the Victorian era. They did it 100 years ago. But one of the things that the Egyptians did not have are degrees. They didn't have degrees. They didn't have any concept of cosine. But they had something that kind of worked the same way. They had this very complex unit called the sekhed. And there it is over there. Let me see if I can remember exactly how a sekhed worked. A sekhed was a horizontal offshoot of a single vertical cubit. All right. So you had a vertical cubit. You had a measure at the bottom, which was 5 palms, 2 fingers, and they knew that this had a set relationship because they had the Pythagorean theorem. So a sekhed is that hypotenuse. All right. They couldn't measure angles, but they knew that set relationships existed with a 90-degree angle, and they could have a sekhed and duplicate all of the functionality of measuring angles, even if they didn't have the exact mathematics to describe it. So they had ways to measure angles so that when they built these pyramids, it came to a point, and they didn't have inconstant angles, or they didn't build 2 sides of the pyramid so it came to a different point. So they had the Pythagorean theorem. They had units of weights and measures. They had a way to determine horizontal offsets, cosine in degrees. So they had pretty elaborate engineering and architectural skills. They could do it. This should cause problems for one of the hypotheses to date. And the Egyptians were intensely proud of their architectural prowess. They were good architects, and they knew they were good architects. Again, many pharaohs are buried with systems with that measuring rods, arguing that even in death they're going to be architects and engineers. So they're very, very proud of their architectural prowess, and they bragged about this in their artwork. And we have artwork from the New Kingdom, from the Middle Kingdom, from the Old Kingdom that shows the construction of palaces, the construction of monuments. Right up above me, there is a group of men hauling a great statue to its new location. You can see there's guys in front and they're pulling. You can see there's guys in the back and they're pushing. You can see that there's actually a guy standing. There he is. You can actually see there's a guy standing in front of the sled that this huge statue is on, and he's probably pouring water or oil in front of the sled so it can slide very easily. And in fact, there's even a guy standing on the knee of the statue, and he's clapping. He's keeping time so that everyone knows they're pulling at the same time or they're pushing at the same time. And this is how they're moving that huge statue to where it's going to rest in the temple complex or in the funeral complex it's going to be. If you look there on the lower left, there's a series of Egyptians. They're measuring out limestone bricks. They're moving rubble. They're working on their great architecture. And there's something missing from these images. I want you to look at these pictures very carefully. And these two are broadly representative. I'm not like cherry picking a pair of images here, but I want you to look at these images. What one figure is missing? In fact, this one figure who's missing from these images, but in modern historical terms, we've included this figure in all of our drawings of Egyptian architecture and all of our drawings of Egyptian construction. But in Egyptian drawings of Egyptian construction, this one figure is absent. He's absent from all Egyptian art. There is never that, well, I'm going to let you figure it out. I'm not going to tell you who's missing. I want you to look at these images and go back and look at how we drew images of Egyptian construction and figure out who's missing. And finally, there are quarries. We know where these huge blocks that built the pyramids come from. And we know here they are. And you can literally see this field where they would basically cut down into the bedrock. They would basically cut the top, and then they would cut the sides of the bedrock, and then they would slice out from the bottom, and then they would have a huge stone which can be tipped on its side or a sled, and then move to the construction site. And up there on the upper left, you can see there's the stumps of these construction blocks. And you don't need terribly complex tools to do this. In fact, looking right up above me, you can see that's evidence of one of the tools they used. Nothing more elaborate than a string saw, where you get a length of cotton thread, dip it in glue, and then roll it in either sand or crushed glass or crushed obsidian, whatever sort of abrasive material you have. And then you have a loop on either side, and you have pretty much a pretty decent saw. And then you grasp each end of that rope and just work it back and forth like that, and it will slice through stone. And in fact, it leaves very distinct marks when it slices through stone. And those marks look exactly like that picture right up above me. And we know we've got handholds. We can even see where they've scored out the areas designated to where they want to cut it. And then we have some blocks that broke, some blocks that weren't acceptable. So there's a lot of error in the construction process. We have the quarries where they carved these rocks from. And we know that they didn't need very, very elaborate tools to do this. And this should cause a big problem for one of our hypotheses. Now, experimental archaeology is when modern archaeologists attempt to do something in an old style to see how it would replicate over time. And this was done quite famously in 1997, when PBS and a number of other people paid a very famous Egyptologist called Mark Lehner. And they said, hey, why don't you build us a little pyramid? There it is. And the trick was they were going to fund Mark Lehner building them a new pyramid on the documentary, This Old Pyramid. And he could only use bronze tools from the Old Kingdom to do, well, not the actual tools, but they were replicas of bronze tools from the Old Kingdom to do it, just to see how things were going. And the answer is, it's all quite possible. I mean, it was an experimental process, so it was quite awkward and ugly at times, but Mark Lehner was able to finish his pyramid on schedule. And there's the pyramid today. It's right at the edge of the Giza Plateau, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the things that they learned very quickly is that when you're working with bronze tools, the bronze is very soft, so it gets chipped and dulled very easily. So basically, half of your workforce is doing nothing but sharpening and reforging tools for the people that are actually working on the pyramid. So basically, even if you don't have very complicated tools, you can build a limestone pyramid. And yes, it does involve very elaborate math underlying, the actual architecture of the pyramid. But again, you only need 2 or 3 people who are really bright to work that math out. The workers, for the most part, they just need to be told where stones go and what the measure on each one should be. And for the most part, the pyramid, in fact, was complete. Now, this is where most lectures or most documentaries or most shows on the pyramids stop. They say, the Great Pyramids of Egypt, the apex of the pyramid tradition. But it wasn't the end of the pyramid tradition. It was the apex, was the top of the pyramid for the pyramid tradition. But there are pyramids that are built after the Old Kingdom. In fact, they continue to build pyramids well into the Middle Kingdom. But these are harsh pyramids. These are harsh to look at. And the two images right up above my yellow box, those are pyramids. They don't look it. They look like huge messy piles of mud bricks because that's exactly what they are. Pyramids continue to be constructed up until the 12th dynasty. They continue to build pyramids right up until the Hyksos invade Egypt. But they've figured out much quicker and much cheaper ways to do it. Instead of cutting limestone from desert bedrock, you can actually just bake mud bricks and rapidly and for a fraction of the cost, build a pyramid out of mud bricks. And it looks fine when it's finished, and it's going to look fine for a few hundred years. And it's only going to start to fall apart 500 or 600 years down the line. And you've been long dead by then, so who cares what your pyramid looks like? And this is what these pyramids look like today. They're basically not even recognizable as pyramids. They're just like huge messy piles of mud brick. But they're there. They're pyramids. Egypt doesn't abandon the tradition of pyramid construction until the New Kingdom. And even then, they're still into necropolises, and they still build mastabas. They build mastabas all the way up to Ptolemaic Egypt. And we can actually see this architectural tradition through time. We can see how we start with mastabas, even elaborate mastabas like the mastaba of Queen Mernith. And we go from mastabas to the Step-Pyramid of Djoser, and even the failed pyramid at Needham. And then we end up with the bent pyramid, the red pyramid, the Great Pyramids of Giza, and then at the end of the tradition, the ugly mud brick pyramids of the Middle Kingdom. We have it, and even in those 6 images on the left side, you can see the rise and fall of an architectural tradition. Does this have any impact on one of our original hypotheses? Because it should. It should cause big problems for one of our hypotheses. Now, we're not quite done with Egypt yet, because we're going to start next. We're going to start talking about the actual archaeology of the pyramid workers themselves, and all of this is in service to that question right there, which I am not going to give you the answer to. You are going to come up with the answer to that question yourself. But that part of archaeology, we're going to take care of that in the next section, and I will see you there.